Okay, so this video, my name's Cordy and I want to talk today about nuance. And what that means is, say your parents were married and for whatever reason they ended up getting a divorce. Years later your mum married a new man, he became your stepdad. What he might bring with him is a new aunt. So we're talking about nuance. Right, anyway, actually what I wanted to talk about was these kind of two devices, the HX Stomp, the Fractal FM3. Really, these things only tend to trend in one direction, so no one who owns a Helix generally will say anything too disparaging about the fractal stuff, but the same is not true in the other direction, and people quite often will call these things toys, say the difference is night and day. Probably there's plenty of people out there that don't really like the Helix stuff and have had negative experiences with it. I think there's also plenty of people out there who don't really like the fractal stuff for various reasons and have negative experiences with it. There's people out there that have not got on with a Kemper, but there's also people in all of those camps that get really good results out of all of those. So the question I wanted to kind of look into today was, who has the claim to the most kind of authentic amp modelling, or the authentic modelling in general, specifically looking at the HX Stomp of the FM3 and at the Mesa Boogie Lonestar, which I have sat down there. I thought, what if I pull up the same settings that I've got on the amp, and I'm going to record it with a condenser mic. On the Helix and the FM3, what I wanted was a Lonestar cab and loaded up with C90s and then mic'd with a 4047, so a Neumann kind of condenser mic. I'm using an Aston Spirit, so there's going to be some difference in the actual mic. So like I say, here's the parameters. You have pretty much the same settings as on the face of the amp on the channel 1 for the clean, and for the channel 2, into a Lonestar cab which is mic'd up with a 4047, as close as I can get it to being dead on the cone. So with the HX Stomp, that was just having it 1 inch away. On the FM3, that was using the B one, which seemed to be the brightest of each of the Lonestar IRs. So here are the results. In this set of 6 clips, in no particular order, you're going to hear a real amp, the Lonestar, you're going to hear an FM3, and you're going to hear an HX Stomp. So what I want you to do maybe is just listen for the first time and maybe write down which ones you prefer of each, maybe which ones you might actually want to hear on a mix or in a mix, maybe write down your least favourite. And then what we'll do towards the end of the video is I'll just reveal which was which. We'll play the clips again with the actual label next to it, and maybe you want to kind of listen to it then, and also then say which ones you prefer and why or whatever. Maybe that'd be interesting, maybe that's not. So you've just seen the clips, and you've seen the real amp, you've seen the FM3, and you've seen the HX Stomp with similar settings. Now they've all got different kind of IRs, and that's a huge part of the sound. Now the FM3, for whatever reason, is sort of limited in actual Lonestar cabs. There's about 10 Lonestar cabs in the FM3 for whatever reason, a little bit limited compared to some of their others. And those are, there's two 57s, two ribbon mics, 121, two 160 ribbon mics, a couple of dynamics, and then two Neumann 4047. So I've used 4047B because I think that was a little bit brighter than 4047. On the HX Stomp, obviously you've got it the same way as most of their cabs are set up, so you've got plenty of scope. So I've opened up the high cut and the low cut on the HX Stomp just because by default it would be set to 8 kHz, so I didn't want that to kind of cloud the thing. So let's talk about, I guess, authenticity of the model. If we're looking at this from the point of view that Line 6 aren't doing legitimate modelling for whatever reason, so there are some people that might live in the fractal world that think that Line 6 are kind of making a really cheap product and don't really care about their models. Maybe it's a limited section of that crowd, but I think there are certainly some people that occasionally jump into the comments, and always it's in that direction. No one from the Helix world says the opposite, if you get what I mean. When we look at the channel 2 of the Mesa Boogie Lonestar, there's a setting called thick, thicker and normal. Now the fractal FM3 model of that, for whatever reason, I don't think actually models that. The HX Stomp does. I do wonder what the argument is for not including that if you are making an authentic model of the thing. Now this kind of goes across into a couple of other areas. In the drive category, Helix and Fractal both model things like the Timmy and the King of Tone. So in the King of Tone model on the FM3, it's just a one-sided pedal with a volume, a gain and a tone. Now if you've got a real King of Tone, you know that's not actually the way that the King of Tone is. The real King of Tone is a two-channel blues breaker pedal. Each side has the volume, the gain and tone, but inside there are dip switches. There's also a presence control. That's what the HX Stomp model actually looks like. So in that sense, is that a more authentic model of a King of Tone? The Timmy, similarly the FM3 model of that, is just a volume, gain, bass cut and treble cut. On the actual Timmy there's some clipping options, and you'll see that in the HX Stomp and Helix they've also modelled that. In terms of an argument about who is doing more authentic modelling, I guess there's a bit more nuance to it than maybe some people might say. So you may end up really liking the fractal stuff anyway, and it doesn't matter about the authenticity of whatever if you really like the unit and you can get good tones out of it. Similarly, if you can get great tones out of an HX Stomp or a Helix, maybe you don't need to worry about people saying that it sounds like a toy. I do really enjoy some of the tones out of the FM3, and the delays and reverbs I will say that I do prefer to the Helix. The drives, however, I prefer on the HX Stomp, and I have to say I'm more familiar with the amps that I like in the Helix than my favourite amps in the FM3. That's not to say that one's better than the other or anything. Now if I was really concerned with just capturing that Mesa Boogie Lonestar tone that I'm getting in the room, I probably wouldn't use either of these devices. I'd either actually just mic that amp in the room, if I could put up with the volume, or I'd get my Kemper out and profile it. And I know for sure that the Kemper would get closer than either of these two to the literal sound in the room. Does that make the Kemper better than either of these two units? Probably not. But, you know, if you're literally trying to capture the sound of that amp in the room and you have that amp in the room, the Kemper I think will do a more authentic job than these two. Now, I also just wanted to say a quick little bit about Neural DSP and what they're doing. And I think similar to either of these companies, I think all of these companies are interested in getting down to a component level of whatever the amp or thing that they're modeling is. I think the process of actually modeling an amplifier involves quite a lot of actual grunt work, and Ben Adrian at Line 6 talks about it taking potentially like a month if that's a simple amp, or 3 months if it's a more complicated amp. So to me that sounds like quite a grueling task anyway. So for anyone who's out trying to make modelers and stuff, I think there's some respect kind of deserved, especially if they end up doing a good job of it. So Fractal, I think they've sort of secured their place. Line 6, I think, are, you know, kind of doing a good job. Certainly at the drive end of the spectrum, you know, the drive pedals that they've modelled, I think they do an amazing job of that. And some of their amp models, certainly I really appreciate. Kemper, I think we know what they did, you know, bringing out the profiler. That at the time, 10 years ago, was a massive deal. And I think we're on the crest of seeing that another company has done that sort of thing. What could Neural DSP have actually brought to the table that we haven't really seen before? We've seen the UI, and in general that looks quite a lot like a Helix. We've seen the profiling or capturing, in general that sounds a lot like what a Kemper does. What I've spotted in Pete Thorne's video is that the way that they're dealing with cabs, I think, is better than either of these two companies so far have achieved. So you know that on the FM3 you sort of scroll through long lists of cabs and you can filter it and all that stuff, but at the end of the day it's just lists and lists of cabs. In the Helix world, I think they've tackled this in a slightly different way. So within each cab, so you might have a 2x12 Lonestar cab, you've got thousands of IRs still, but they're kind of organised by microphone and by distance. I think those are legitimate IRs that they've organised in that way. Now, I also think that Neural DSP, what they've done is essentially organised it in a slightly different way, where you can move around the mic on the cab and you can select different mics and different cabs. But I think to me that looks like an even more intuitive way, again, of bringing the cab selection kind of problem to a guitarist and saying, look, this is how we've solved that. So I think sort of some applause for Neural DSP there. If that's maybe one of the innovations that they bring, then I think there's a bit of respect due there. Did you prefer any of those tones? What do you think? And now at the end of the video I'm going to put the labels up next to them as to what they actually were, and you can decide for yourself which you prefer. Certainly I think one is darker than the others, and certainly I think both of these, the channel 2 has less gain than the actual Mesa did for whatever reason. And let's also not forget that at the other side of the Mesa Boogie Lonestar there are other settings that you can mess around with, and I think you can have 6L6s or EL34s. There's plenty more complexity even within that one amp that probably both companies were able to get their hands on that isn't actually modelled in those either. So, you know, there's plenty of reasons why things might sound different, but does either one sound heads and shoulders better than the other? I'm not really sure. Does either one sound better than the amp? Possibly, depending on what you were going for. And yeah, so that's this video done, innit? Cheers.